the frontier. When you think of this era, you may think of a hot sun blazing in the sky as dust fills the air, hot days with hotter tensions, and few think of the winters. But these winters were the secret killers in the Old West. One day it could be a little chilly. You might need a coat, but it isn't too unbearable. Temperatures would drop below zero. The wind picks up, sending the wind chills to well below zero. When this happens, how do you keep yourself, your family, and your livestock alive, especially in an era without any electricity? The West is gigantic, so it depends on where you live. In some regions, the winters were mild, with snow being a rarity. This weather came with its own problems, but one usually didn't have to worry about freezing. But in the mountains or in high latitudes, that air could freeze you, and when winter hit, that snow would pile up faster than a deck of cards. In the Dakotas or in Montana, the temperatures could sometimes get as cold as minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 34.4 degrees Celsius. When things get cold nowadays, you may sit down in your heated room, brew some hot cocoa, and watch a Western on Netflix. But back in those days, there was no relaxation. You needed to act fast, because with the temperatures dropping and your body seeking warmth, waiting too long meant possible death. If you had no food, you'd perish. If your crops or livestock died, it may spell the end for your family farm. If you didn't prepare beforehand, you were outside, racing against the clock to scavenge food. In some more extreme cases, the solution would be food scrounged on the ground in hopes of preserving long enough until either the weather let up or spring happened. Sometimes the winter would halt all mail and stagecoaches. Snow would cover the ground so high that getting horses through the large drifts of snow was next to impossible. If you sent a letter, you'd be lucky to get a response back a few months later if the winters got too harsh. And you'd be alone, in isolation. Days could feel like months. While one could read, write, or maybe do some cooking, moving too much expels energy, and if you didn't prepare, your actions would be limited. And if the frostbite and hypothermia didn't get you, the cabin fever would. After all, if you were lucky, your companions would be your family. But even then, you'd have to take care of them in hopes that they wouldn't need a doctor during these harsh winter months. How did you survive? Nowadays, modern conveniences make us mostly unafraid of winter. But in the frontier times, you were prepared from your head down to your toes, lest you wanted a grave dug for you in the spring. In fact, a good chunk of your day may have been spent preparing for the next wintry day. You could have spent the day gathering more insulation, making or repairing winter clothes, or breaking apart ice so that water could flow free. It kept you busy, but you had little time to yourself, and the grind could kill many people, or make them go crazy. Let's look at just some ways people prepare. When you went outside, you weren't in your hoodie and sweatpants, but several layers of clothing designed to keep your body warm. Mainly, winter clothes consisted of 3 layers: the base, middle, and outer layer. Your base layer would consist of wool or linen. These materials would wick moisture, so if cold snow got in them, they wouldn't stay for too long. This prevented frostbite and cold from settling in. If you were already cold and wet, allowing that to linger reduces body temperature, consumes more energy, and allows for those extremely cold elements to linger on your body. Your middle layer would be how you kept heat and made it yours. Think of your thick woolens, vest, or even animal furs. Finally, over that layer, you would wear another animal hide, oilskins, or canvas slickers. These would help reduce the cold bite of the winter wind and snow. What about your feet? Wool socks would help you wick moisture, while moccasins or leather boots would keep you warm. But even then, the cold winter could penetrate your clothing if it was harsh enough, so an option would be to layer up. Some people added more insulation to their boots using Mother Nature herself. Straw, grass, or any spare wool would be stuffed into the shoes to give them more warmth. This method could get a little messy, but tough times call for tougher measures. What about your head? Fur hats would be the most obvious option, and some people would wrap wool around them. Some frontiersmen even put buffalo horns on their buffalo caps as a sign of power. Other ways to keep warm include wool gaiters, which protect your pants and ankles. If you had any spare quilts around, this would double for the missus as a skirt or shawl. Many would walk around wearing these even outside if the temperatures got low enough and the wind picked up sharply. One material you would not use is cotton. Cotton can be great for summer, but in the winter a phrase was commonly whispered, "Cotton kills." How did it kill? Cotton was very absorbent and would take forever to dry. So if you wore cotton socks and walked in the snow, that cold water would stay in your feet for a long time, opening the door to frostbite and hypothermia. And if you were in it for too long, you may have had to amputate that foot. In these times, that could have been a death sentence, because there weren't any antibiotics to help with infection. In certain cases, the amputations weren't even done by doctors either if they couldn't reach the patient in time. These clothes help you stay warm. Often they came from hides, nature's way of keeping animals warm. Clothes would help you inside and outside. But when you were inside, you probably wanted a little more warmth. This is where your shelter came in. During frontier times, most people would live in log cabins. These cabins came from trees that withstood many winters, perfect for a frontiersman. For insulation, you'd often use chunking mud or other materials that ensured there were no drafts. This would be placed in between any of the holes the cabin possessed, preventing wind from coming in and cooling the place down. These cabins tended to be the best for fighting cold weather. But not everyone had a log cabin. Instead, many would build sod homes. In the prairies, wood could be tough to come by, but sod grass was plentiful. These homes looked like little mounds, and while they weren't the most ideal living situation, they had strong insulation. Their walls were thick, keeping it warm inside and preventing Old Man Winter from knocking. Some living situations would be a blend of log cabins for families and sod houses for livestock, because the sod would provide better insulation for the animals, while the log cabins offered more fortitude for when the wind got strong. Either way, dried grasses would be placed in the floorboards or in corners to provide more insulation. But sometimes you're away from home when a winter storm hits. How do you keep warm when that happens? Staying out in the open leaves you susceptible to wind and other elements, which can chill you to the bone. It wasn't an option, and if the storm got particularly bad, you had to act fast. Temporary shelters were one such way that you could hide until the worst of it was over. Some people would bring tents, but when that didn't happen, they'd run for the neatest cave or make one from the snow itself. Snow caves are similar to igloos, where, while made from cold materials, they provide insulation from the wind and extremely low temperatures. Not the most ideal living situation, but at least you're living. Back to the home. What about your bedding? Mattresses may have been made from straw or feathers, while wool blankets or animal hides were common ways to wrap yourself up at night. Finally, let's talk about how you could heat up your home when it was still cold. Wood stoves were like central heating back in the day. Each stove had a flue lined with clay to let the smoke escape. The stoves were used for everything, from heating to cooking to heating stones you could use as a makeshift warmer for your clothes. The ashes the stove left behind could also be great dryers for your boots, but they could get messy. Some people also used more than wood for their stoves. Buffalo chips and dried dung were common fire fuels. While gathering, this was very unpleasant, but it was relatively odorless. Still, most people nowadays would not set up their campfire using buffalo dung. Still, while the stove was a lifesaver, it wouldn't last forever. Often, frontiersmen would wake up to see the stove had burned out, usually woken up by the bite of winter. They'd rush to light it back up before hypothermia settled in. Speaking of lighting, homes would also be lit with candles. These candles would be made from beeswax, or if you didn't have anything else, animal tallow. This would add a beefy smell to your home, but you got used to it. Another thing to keep in mind was that during these times, many humans slept in 2 4-hour naps each day. For example, you may fall asleep in the morning or afternoon for 4 hours, then sleep in the evening. Many in the cabin would sleep in different shifts to ensure that everything was okay. Others would fall asleep once the morning sun warmed everything up and before the evening cooled everything down. Since the Industrial Revolution, this type of sleeping has died out in exchange for an 8-hour sleep. But in these times, you wanted to be the most alert in the afternoons, when the temperatures were the warmest. 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. was the sweet spot for working outside. In many cases, however, even if they were not sleeping, many people stayed in bed because it was toasty, so long as the extremities were kept under the covers. Another inconvenience was how small your home was. If you live in a small apartment, it's still giant compared to a cabin. These cabins could be as small as 14 by 16 feet, and many would lack windows because it helped keep the heat in. Sure, it was toasty, but imagine living in a home that small, and with a family. You'd better get used to crowds. Finally, another challenge frontier homes would have was pests. You were cold, and the rats, snakes, and bugs were cold as well. These creatures would not only be annoying, but could also damage homes. For example, a rat may gnaw through the wood and spread disease in the process. Having a pet designed to hunt rats was one way you could avoid this, which was why many on the frontier kept working animals during the winter to help with this. And if you didn't have a pet, bullets may fly. But despite these challenges, the frontier home was as prepared for winter as it ever would be, with insulation to keep it warm. While many of us wouldn't want to live like this nowadays, it seemed high-tech compared to the way people before them lived. This covered one of the main human needs: shelter. But what about food? Let's dive into the ways food was prepared for the winter so nobody starved. Nowadays, you know when a winter storm is coming and can stock up on groceries the night before. But on the frontier, you needed enough food to last you throughout the entire season. And your best friend at this time, sodium. You'd be eating smoked, salted meats for a good while, as these lasted a long time, were rich in protein and calories, and easy to store. And you better like your vegetables pickled. Your bountiful harvest would consist of cans of preserved fruits and vegetables that would last you through the season, usually held in a root cellar. This structure was cool and humid, making it ideal for storing vegetables and other perishables. Another common food was pemmican. Many frontiers adopted this indigenous food due to its nutrition and long shelf life. It was a mixture of dried meat with fat and berries for sweetening. The food was the perfect nutritional powerhouse, and if you didn't have food, you may go on a hunt. Venison and other game meat would be staples of the frontier diet, but many did not want to do this unless they had to. After all, each bullet was precious. What about water? Some frontiersmen had wells that delivered fresh water all year round. Wells tended to avoid freezing, but not everyone on the frontier had them. So, if you weren't so lucky, what could you do? One answer: use the snow around you. Snow and ice could be melted over the stove, and that would help to sanitize it. While not the most ideal way to drink water, it was a lifesaver for many men during these times, especially when the wells freeze up. Some people also had ice houses. These insulated structures kept ice, often gathered from rivers, frozen. The ice was then cut, usually using tools such as chisels or pickaxes. The ice would either be melted to use as drinking water, or the ice offered preservation for some of the foods kept in the house. Finally, you needed fuel to keep the home warm and to cook food and melt ice. Frontiersmen would cut wood all day long. Hardwood, like oak or hickory, would burn for a long time. A little went a long way. Meanwhile, softwood, like pine or fir, would burn quickly but make for great tinder. In some areas, you may have had peat or coal as well to keep your homes warm. Food, ice, and fuel were your lifeblood during winter. This wasn't a last-minute task, but one you would do year-round. You could never have too much, but you could easily have too little. You have food, water, and shelter covered. But how did you travel? Not everyone in frontier times was a person who holed themselves up in winter. Many people wanted to go to town, either as a career or to buy more supplies. Snowshoes and moccasins provided easy gliding across the snow. People would go on a horse-powered sleigh or wagon. Some even used oxen, which weren't as fast but were strong. The coaches and sleds often had straw bedding, keeping the riders warm during their travels. Of course, travel provided its own challenges. If you were walking, you needed to be prepared for harsh winds and emergencies. And if you were on a stagecoach or sled, it was so easy for it to fall over during a windstorm, or for you to get lost in a harsh blizzard. Bringing some extra food was important here, and so was taking care of your animals. If you were cold, they were cold, and if you weren't careful, it's possible that your animal would perish. That's why you would have brought horse blankets, plenty of oats for them, and be sure they had plenty of food and shelter back at home. And when you reached your destination, who would you talk to? This is where community comes in. When you think of a frontiersman surviving the winter, you may imagine him doing it alone, or, if not alone, with his wife and children. But in these times, the entire community often pulled together to ensure everyone's safety. If you lived in a small village, it was common for you to share the resources. If you needed some fuel and your neighbor needed food, you may trade. If you would be gone for a while, your neighbor may help to watch your livestock while you're gone and keep them safe from the weather and animals. If you weren't heard for a while, someone may stop by to see if you were doing well. If you were new in town, especially from an area where snow was rarer, people were more open to teaching you how to winterize your home. People would help you build the walls you needed to keep the cold air out, share meals with you, and help you gather foliage. Another way communities would help each other in wintertime is through entertainment. When you were trapped in your home, you could get stir-crazy. However, if you had others in your house, you may tell stories around the fire or sing songs. Some songs and stories you may have told could have been related to winter. For example, if you had children who wanted to stray too far from the house, you may have told them that a snow monster would take them away, with that story being a metaphor for a blizzard, a bear, or an avalanche. Of course, it did depend on the community you were in. Some areas were friendlier to foreigners than others, but in these times, people would mingle and help each other in times of need. When you're dealing with a crisis, helping each other, helping those less fortunate, and passing the time away were vital to surviving until spring. But even with all of that, if a massive blizzard came, there may have been nothing you could do. Nowadays, you may look out your window and see everything turning right as a sign of glee. As long as the power doesn't go out, you can be snug in your home for a few days and not have to worry about work or school. But in these times, the frontier people looked outside their cabins with dread. When it got white, it was a death sentence just to leave their homes. Even if you intended to walk over to the barn, all it took was for you to get stuck in the snow to spell your doom. And even if you usually knew how to get to your barn, it was easy to get lost with such low visibility. Some people came prepared by fastening a rope from their barn door to their cabin door. When they traveled outside, they held onto the rope for dear life. This rope helped lead them to their barns and provided an easy way to get back. One reason you may go to the barn is to ensure your animals are safe. If there was a water trough, you may have had to break up the ice so they could drink. You may want to ensure that no mice are getting into your feed, or you may want to see if your animals were safe inside. After all, your animals needed you, and you needed them. Your cattle could act as emergency food, provide milk, and be sold off come spring so you can earn money. And the cattle needed you for consistent food and water. Of course, not everyone had barns. In that case, it was likely that your animals would die outside. If you had a lot, they may have survived by huddling together, and their warmth may be enough. But in some cases, they may have died because there wasn't enough feed to go around. Often, farmers would fatten them up in the summer to ensure their survival for winter. But others weren't so lucky. One example of livestock dying off was the winter of 1886 to 1887. The summer of 1886 was a dry one, with a lack of water and grass already a problem. And then the winter came. The animals knew. The birds flew south earlier, and beavers started gathering much more wood than usual. Some animals, like cattle, responded by growing thicker coats. But many farmers did not see the signs. San Francisco got nearly 4 inches of snow, a rarity at the time. Temperatures got in the negatives, sometimes up to -43 degrees Fahrenheit, -42 degrees Celsius. People died, and hundreds of thousands of cattle also died. This event became known as the Big Die-Up. Imagine being a farmer and staying holed up in your cabin for months. Then spring arrives. When you come out, you see your cattle, not happily grazing but part of a cattle graveyard. The cows that died were arguably the lucky ones. The cattle that did survive had frostbite, were emaciated, and were on the verge of death. When sold, they sold for much less than healthy cattle. Many farms went under. This not only reflected small-time farmers, but even Teddy Roosevelt, whose ranch was hit by the harsh winter. This event changed how we do farming, with open grazing becoming less common after that. Finally, while the blizzard was dangerous, being inside posed its own risks. Have you ever heard the term cabin fever? This term originates from people mentally deteriorating from being inside for so long. After all, you didn't have much to do. Even books were something for rich people. You may spend a reasonable amount of time reading your Bible, not just because you want to rely on your faith during this time, but because it is something to do. If you had people living with you, you'd play games, tell stories, and even drink the night away. You may spend time crafting with what little supplies you have. But in a small home with limited supplies, you could only go so far. Think about it. Most of us have access to limitless entertainment, but we still get bored when at home for too long. Now imagine you had nothing, not even electricity. Even if the blizzard lasted only a week, time would go to a crawl. And back then, mental health was still not understood that much. Some people may have believed they were being possessed when they were at their breaking points. Many people would die in winter, but many others made it to the end. The air felt wetter, the ice was melting, and grass started to poke from the ground. For many families, it was a relief. But the work was never done. They'd have to repair fences, remove any dead animals, and prepare for the next winter. Maybe Mother Nature would make up for the harsh winter by having a mild one, but she could also deliver an even worse winter. After everything thawed, people focused on the upcoming winter. Preparation never stopped, and some who survived the winter would take what they learned from the previous winter and apply it to the next one, and that is how people survived the winter. Many of us wish we lived in a different era, and watching cowboy movies, we may wish we lived in the days of the Wild West. But we don't think about how tough we'd have to be to live in these times. It wasn't just the outlaws either, but Mother Nature. So be glad that you have a heater. Have you had to deal with tough winters? Do you have other stories about surviving Mother Nature? Let us know in the comments below. And as usual, like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Until next time.